Making this video outside as I'm dealing with my paint drips. Now, yeah, they're a little bit worse than I thought once I started sanding them. This is done with all of this area here I've just done in the past, I don't know, less than half an hour, I think. 220 grit sandpaper. I'm going to go over the whole thing, wet sand with 400 once I get all the drips. There's still more work to do up here. This is what I did the first day. I think that was my last video where it started raining like crazy. I'm in my backyard now and actually have some decent weather. One thing I noticed, these areas here where the heaviest of the paint was pooled up on the edge, whenever my video is where I painted it, I haven't looked right now. I'm going to guess that was 3-4 weeks ago. The paint in these really high, thick drips still wasn't really dry. And what I mean by that is, I noticed as I'm trying to sand down the large collected paint on these edges, that it was just kind of gumming up the sandpaper, the 220 grit, and it just wasn't really coming off. And what I did today is I took my thumbnail and I went like that, and I could scrape the paint all the way down to the primer. It just came right off on my fingernail. So it's so thick that it's just gummy, and I guess just not dried even after all this time sitting in the house. So that helped me move a little bit faster once I noticed that. I noticed it over here, and then over here I just kind of went over with my thumbnail first and took most of the paint off with my thumbnail, and then took the sandpaper to smooth it out. And so that progress is a little bit faster. So that's where the paint is really blobbed up, that I found that. Now that I'm outside and there's some sun and the light is much better, I noticed some pooling down underneath in this area, underneath here, that I hadn't seen, and a little bit here. I mean, they weren't bad, but I figured if I'm going down to this, I definitely have to put more paint on it, so I might as well take care of all of those visible drips. These were so slight that maybe when I coated another coat they would kind of disappear, maybe, but I decided, well, I'm here, I might as well take them down. So again, the goal is just to get rid of the drips. It's not to get down to primer. It just so happens that when it's really thick like this, it does take me all the way down to the primer to get rid of it, but that also is going to help blend. So the thick ones, instead of just trying to sand the thick areas down to, white paint, which again is impossible because it just starts gumming up and turning kind of gooey, it's down to primer, and then it's fading back up into the height of the paint. So once I go over the whole thing with 400 grit, hopefully when I hit these with paint, that'll blend in and you won't see low spots and higher spots. That's the hope. I can see right here is probably an area I need to do a little bit more sanding on here. And like I said, I just did that area. I've still got the rest of it to double check, and I have to do this area, which again, there's a blob there. Hopefully there's enough light out here to see that. I'm not sure. Right along there, right here, it's pooled up right here. That's another one that looks like it might be thick enough that I can just kind of scrape it off with my thumbnail. And some of these other areas that I did just with like mainly 400 grit and maybe a little 220 grit. Here's one that I can definitely take off with my thumbnail. I can tell just this bottom edge here. In fact, yeah, coming off a little bit with my thumbnail, but I'm thinking, oh, there we go. So I'm thinking also some of that is heat. I think the friction of the sandpaper going over that paint also kind of softens it and turns it more gooey, so it's easier to peel off. Other than that, and when I say peel off, I mean you're scraping it off. It's not like it comes off in a sheet or anything. Other than that, I mean, yeah, I can see, whoa, I don't know, some stuff on the lip there I didn't notice, but yeah, so there's some more areas, but most of it's on the front. Come around to the back and look at the back. The back's not nearly as bad. I can see it's weird. There's an area there. I think I might have sanded that off the other day. But the back is not nearly as bad as the front. Of course, that's the opposite of what you want because the front is more visible, but it is what it is, and I'm going to deal with it. Although it does kind of look like a worn droid. Throw some dirt on there and your weathering's pretty much done, but yeah, it's not quite what I'm going for at this point. Not sure what else to say. I was thinking of maybe putting the shoulder hubs in today. They go in this opening here, and then there's threaded metal rod that goes through it and all the way down here. And one thing that people have said is to get this part to print without supports, Michael Baddeley, who designed it, has got this at an angle. So as it's printing, this is an angle that your printer can print that overhang without being full straight, perpendicular, so that it requires support. So the hole in the bottom where this threaded rod comes through, you're supposed to put a nut on that end, but it's at like a, whatever that is, 45 degree or so angle. So if you put a nut, it's not going to be flat. And so one thing that somebody did that I thought, well, that's a cool idea, is they heated up the nut. They didn't say how, but I'm guessing if I just kind of, because you can't come up, you could come up through the bottom if you do this before you glue the rings together. So there's an idea for those of you who haven't glued the rings together. Do this before it's glued together. If you didn't glue the rings together, you could just put the threaded rod and then heat up the nut with like a lighter, a little butane torch or something, and then you pull the rod through and it melts the nut into the bottom. And so that not only helps lock it in place, because now it's got a nut shaped opening instead of a round one, but it also is sunk in just a little bit. Don't go too far, don't go crazy, just enough to kind of get it in there to help, so it's not at like a 45 degree angle. So because I've glued these together, I obviously can't blowtorch to heat the nut because I'd melt the surrounding plastic. But what I could do is hold a soldering iron against the nut and the threaded rod for several minutes and then pull it up and see if it does start to melt its way in. So I was thinking of doing that today, but obviously, not obviously, what am I trying to say? But because I'm still working on the paint, I am lifting this thing in and out of the house, and those shoulders are really heavy duty units with a lot of layers, not layers, but infill, perimeters. Again, if you look at the link in my description of all my videos, I've got a link to the Printed Droid site, and on there is a PDF document for some suggestions for the parts of this build and how many perimeters and what percent infill to use, and I went pretty much with what it says there. So these shoulder pieces are fairly big, fairly solid, and they would add so much weight to this that as I'm bringing it in and out of the house, which I tend to use these as the handy handles, although sometimes I use this and the front of the utility arm panel here. The more weight that's on that and the more in and out of the house I do in lifting, I might end up cracking something. So I decided to hold off on those. I've trial fitted them in and they fit in. They're not tight, they're a little bit wiggly, and they shouldn't be. I'm not sure what's up with that, but they should be fine once they're in there and bolted in. I'm thinking they should be fine. But yeah, that's a tip for people who haven't glued the first and second rings together. Think of the hole right here that goes all the way up to here, and then the shoulder piece goes in here, and the nut goes on top, kind of like that. Think about the fact that this is at an angle, and so it's a little bit awkward to get the nut on there and have it stay in place because it's not flush up against the plastic. That you might want to heat up the nut and pull it through just enough to get it melted in to where it's in place. And even after you've done that, I'll bet that you can push on the rod and it will probably pop out. It won't be like glued in with the melted plastic. It'll probably just be a nice piece that's the shape of the nut. So pull it up, feel that it's melted its way in just a little, and then hold it there. Maybe even put some tape or another nut to hold it in place while it cools down. And then when it's cooled down, try pushing the threaded rod down and see if it comes out with the nut, and you've got a nice opening that will hold the nut in place. So yeah, I think I've lost my weather. It is definitely fall and low temperatures now, so it's a nice day out here, but I don't know, it feels to me like it's in the 50s, and I'm not going to paint in the 50s. Maybe might risk primer, bringing it into something, and then bring it inside and put a couple small electric heaters next to it to make sure it dries. But I'm not going to do white paint when it's this low of a temperature, because then I'm just risking too low of a temperature and possibly too high of humidity and messing it up even further than I already did by getting way too impatient on the front of this thing and putting the paint on way too thick. So yeah, just an update so I can get a video out this week showing that I'll be spending some time sanding, and don't think I'll be able to paint anymore this year, which is kind of a bummer, but it'll give me time, I guess, to get this to the point where it's ready for its next coat. Yeah, so that's the update for now. Alright, 57 degrees out here. I'm starting to get a little bit chilly. I did most of the sanding now. So I've gone over this top bit and done some more sanding. A little top of the coin slot area, a little bit more there. Bottom, this area that I hadn't even noticed before, almost looked like something touched the paint too. It was kind of the way it was hanging down, which wouldn't surprise me. This, if it shows up just along here, I think that's from bumping something in the house. I don't have much room for all this. So yeah, the back is actually not that bad. And then I'll show around here. This is my, I'm not going to call it a crack, because I don't even think it's so much a crack. It's the join between two pieces. And it was just a hairline, and now it's a giant mess. This is going to be a pain in the butt to make look nice, I think. Maybe not. But what's weird is, I mean, yeah, it's sanded, but I can't see any crack at all. down there. So you can see some different vertical lines that are print red. That's the Bondo glazing putty. I printed this in white. These parts of olive ring 2 and 3 are all white PLA. So you can see a gray vertical line going all the way down here from the bottom all the way up. That's the join between the two, and I think the gray might be the epoxy. And what's really weird to me is how, I can't feel a little gap in the join. I can't see anything, but it definitely was there. So I think what I'm just going to do is melt with the soldering iron from the bottom to the top, and then maybe fill the gap with filler and not fill it with more filament, just because trying to be less destructive. This is already gonna, you can feel a big height difference between the painted part and the part I've sanded down to the bare plastic. So yeah, I'm gonna be making a big divot with a soldering iron to melt those two pieces together there where it cracked. And the crack, I think, only went down about to here or so. And I made sure to go farther than the crack. Okay, I am calling it a crack. Whatever. It's basically I didn't get enough epoxy in there. That's what I'm pretty sure the problem is. So you can see this weird discoloration here. That's where I've already, before I primed it, from the backside, I melted together and melted a little bit of the top together because I knew that I didn't get enough epoxy there, and it did have a little separation, gap, crack, whatever. After I primed it, I thought it was pretty much taken care of, and it wasn't. So yeah, I'll go with a soldering iron and melt those areas together, and then, that's gonna be a bit thick to fill the gap with just the Bondo glazing putty, but I don't really want to, like I said, weld filament in there because that makes a really wide, big mess to print. And when you weld the new PLA in, it tends to be stronger than the original printed PLA, and I think that might be something to do with the heat. Heating it with a soldering iron and melting it, I think maybe might make it hotter. I've heard about tempering plastic, and I think that might be the effect, because when I do, this is just a soldering iron, like, kind of going between two pieces to hold it together, not really a weld. This, if you can see it with the light outside again, is a gap that I didn't sand or fill anything in. I just melted the two pieces together. But when I do, here's a prime example, and again, let me go around to this side. Sorry if this camera motion is making people ill. Maybe it shows it better here. These pieces, because it's in the shoulder area, I melted the two together, so I created a trough with the soldering iron, and then I filled it with new filament and kind of smooshed it over, and then sanded it. And it still sticks up just a tad in a few places. I've got it pretty much knocked down, but it does have that effect where when you're sanding, it tends to be harder to sand the stuff that you melt in than the actual parts. And I think that's because the plastic is getting tempered the way that it's being melted with a soldering iron. I could be full of baloney, could be making stuff up, but I think that's why. So yeah, when I do that, if I did that back here, it would make it even harder to smooth this out. This is going to have to anyway probably be pulled back, much further to get that a nice gradual, you know, fix. I'm don't have delusions of just being able to melt that, put some putty in, and get it nice and flush without going back a ways. Down here it's right near this panel line, so that should make that part a bit easier. But yeah, I might have to pull this out wider. But yeah, anyway, I think it is held together pretty good with the epoxy that is in there, and having me melt the back and the top a little bit. So if I just make a trough melting these two together, I think that might be enough to take care of it, ever wanting to open that gap again. But we'll see. I'll run the soldering iron over it and see how much of a mess I make, and decide what I want to do at that point. But yeah, that's my biggest oops. It is on the back, and I'm gonna try and do this with one hand, which is probably really stupid, but I don't think I showed what I did. Excuse the camera. Better shot of what I did on the bottom. Okay, now what I wanted to do was paint the bottom, right? I painted, when I was painting the body, I started on the bottom, and then I did some of these areas to get paint down, because it's easier to get the paint obviously spraying in this direction on areas like this than it is to spray up trying to get paint on areas like this. And then once I did that, I wanted to flip it back right side up and do the rest of it when it's right side up. So how I did that, I described before, but I don't think I showed very well. These, and I could probably take the tape off because, well, I am going to be painting some of this area another coat, and it might get paint on them, but it's basically some of the extra bolts for mounting the skirt, not the skirt, yeah, the skirt and the third leg support piece that go through these bolt holes. So this is a bolt, 3 nuts, and then I put it in, and then I just hand tightened another nut on the bottom. And there you go. And that's going to be covered by the skirt, so it doesn't matter that that's not painted, but I didn't really want to get a bunch of paint all over the bolts, and so they're like stuck together, the nuts and the bolts and everything. So, and the reason I did that, I'll put that back on after the video. The reason I did that is because they are all the same height, give or take a few millimeters, because they're all a bolt, 3 nuts screwed all the way down to the bolt, so they're all touching, and then in the hole, so it's a nice level surface. And I also did not put them here. You can see a little gap there. This first ring here is 4 pieces, and so this is where 2 of them are glued together, this is where 2 of them are glued together, so on both sides. So here, 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 and here there are seams, so I decided to put these bolts where there aren't seams, just so the weight of this thing upside down wasn't pressing on one of these seams, just to prevent it from cracking. And again, you can see a gap there, and that's because I have glued all of these together, and then I went over with a soldering iron, melted them together, and then put filament in, and then smushed the filament all over, so they are glued and plastic welded together on the inside. And the outside, because I didn't want to spend a bunch of time cleaning up, they are not. They're just glue and then filler material to fill the gaps. And because that gap is inside where the skirt is going to be, it won't show. and it's not going to affect the strength of the piece. So it disappears when it gets out here. Same thing here, the crack, let's see, goes to about here, and then nothing the rest of the way. The other two don't even seem to be able to see it. So yeah, just something you can do if you want to flip your body upside down or right side up when this paint is wet, is just use some bolts and nuts and tape over them if you don't want them to get paint on them, and then when you're done painting it, you just flip it upside down and it won't touch the ground. So I think that's all I've got for today. Went over this with a microfiber cloth to get the majority of the sanding dust off. And of course, now that I'm looking at it with the light in a slightly different angle and this thing upside down, I can see some more areas that can use a little more sanding. But like I said, it's 57 degrees out here and I'm currently just in a t-shirt, so it's a little bit chilly, and I've been doing this for about an hour and a half, so I'm gonna call it a day, since I don't have any delusions we're gonna get another 70 something degree day with no rain in the near future. So I don't think I'll be painting this unless I find some place indoors that I could do it. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Battle damaged droid paint job.